Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and the second video about the resurrection of Jesus. In the previous video, I gave a very brief introduction into what the New Testament is. And one of the things I noted was that the New Testament is a collection of 27 books from at least 8 authors that are named by tradition, or 9 if we include the unknown author of Hebrews. What does that mean? It means that after these 27 books were written, by some sort of process, they were combined. Somehow, at some point, these 27 books, all of these 27 books, and none but these 27 books, ended up together. But how? And when? And on whose authority? Surely, whoever combined those books must have had some serious amount of religious authority among the earliest Christians, right? So, who was it? Well, if you spend perhaps a little too much time on certain corners of the internet, you may think you already know the answer. Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. But I'm sorry to have to burst that bubble. By all accounts, the Canon of the New Testament, canon being a fancy word that means something like rule or standard, but in this context means authoritative collection of books, was already largely established before Constantine became emperor or before the Council of Nicaea was held. And the debate about some books continued for some time after. The Council of Nicaea was therefore not about the canon of the New Testament. It was primarily about a nifty theological dispute about the precise nature of Jesus' divinity. The question was if Jesus was eternally begotten, or whether he was begotten at a time before creation. If that goes over your head, don't worry. It goes over most first-year seminary students' heads as well. But the point is this. The canon of the New Testament was not a topic of conversation at Nicaea at all. On the other hand, perhaps you grew up in a church and your impression was quite the opposite. Perhaps you kind of assumed that whenever any of the New Testament authors, be it Paul or Matthew or Peter, finished one of their Gospels or letters, they would mail it out and attach a little note saying, "Oh, by the way, this is not just me writing it, it is also inspired by God. So you should all add this to your New Testaments from now on." And this way, the New Testament grew one Gospel and one letter at a time. But I'm sorry to have to burst that bubble too. Since the formation of the New Testament is much more of a historical process, and though we can identify a few important moments of that process, a lot of events, meetings, conversations, and yes, arguments and debates, have sadly been lost and can only be partially reconstructed. But one thing seems clear. It was a little bit more messy than all Christians simply and immediately accepting new books as they were being written, and always and unanimously rejecting books that aren't currently part of the New Testament. So then, what is the truth? Well, as with many historical questions, often we only have a few pieces of the puzzle and we are forced to try and piece them together without knowing the full picture. But before I look at some pieces of evidence, I want to ask you the following question. What sort of answer would satisfy you? Would you be satisfied if there was a church council, maybe early in the 2nd century, that definitively decided what the New Testament was going to be? Or would you be satisfied if there was a clear, simple set of tests that some church fathers applied to all potential New Testament books, and that these 27 books passed those objective tests and no other? But no. History, and that includes theological history, has a knack of only writing things down when there was a debate or disagreement. If everyone agrees on something, everywhere all the time, then why bother writing it down? But if someone says something wrong, oh boy. I mean, think about it. If someone makes a good YouTube video, you may give it a thumbs up, but you aren't likely to leave a comment beyond perhaps a thank you or very helpful. But if someone is wrong, you might type out an entire dissertation. And if you're really worked up, you go into the comment section and start arguing with people you've never met, and likely never will. All the while, the original video gets boosted in the algorithms and thus gets more views. And believe it or not, the same is true with early Christianity and the historical evidence we have for the formation of the canon. For some time, Christians broadly agreed about which books were to be read in church, and nobody really bothered writing anything down. But then, when someone was wrong, oh boy, all of a sudden these early church leaders began to write. And who was this first wrong person, you might ask? Well, that honor goes to Marcion of Sinope. We know little about Marcion, other than that he was excommunicated in the year 144 for his beliefs, which included beliefs about which books should and should not be part of the Bible. First, he rejected the whole Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. Next, he rejected the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and John, leaving only Luke, though in an altered form. After that, he only accepted 10 of Paul's letters, namely Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Philemon, and, can you guess the 10th letter? The letter to the Laodiceans. Just a little nerdy side note here. Paul briefly mentions in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 16, that he also wrote a letter to the Laodiceans, and he encouraged the Colossians to exchange letters with Laodicea. Though it seems likely that Paul did indeed write a letter to Laodicea, this letter is now lost. Yet there was a piece of writing circulating from the 4th century onward that claimed to be this lost letter. But almost everyone, yes, even back then, believed it to be a forgery. However, it is uncertain what Marcion's letter to the Laodiceans truly was. It could have been an early version of this 4th century forgery. It could be a different forgery, or it could be the canonical letter to the Ephesians that Marcion knew under this different name. In any case, Marcion's canon was, or perhaps not technically the first, but at least he was the first to force the church at large to begin a robust debate about which books should and should not be included in the New Testament. Now what happened next is an absolutely fascinating, multi-century long back and forth between various groups and church fathers that I can only summarize very, very briefly. But beyond the details of the debate, here is something that is helpful to keep in mind. Instead of looking for a black and white picture of canonical versus non-canonical books, or books that did or did not make it into the New Testament, it is helpful to work with this 2x2 grid. The top row are all the books that did make it into the New Testament, and the bottom row are the books that did not make it. Then the left column are what I call the non-controversial books, and on the right the controversial books. Alternatively, they could be labeled universal agreement and hotly contested. This means that the books in the top left square are all the books that everyone, except for Marcion, immediately accepted. In the top right, we have all the New Testament books that did ultimately make it into the New Testament, but only after quite some debate. The bottom left are books that were never seriously considered, even if Dan Brown seems to think otherwise. And bottom right are books that, though they ultimately didn't make it, were seriously considered by some. But the big question is, how to reconstruct this enormous debate? In short, There are three types of evidence that are often used by scholars today to recreate the flow of the debate. First, and most obviously, there are lists given by church fathers. Those are the early church leaders from the first couple of centuries. Second, there are writings of early church fathers that don't actually have a formal list, but they quote from various books that are now part of the New Testament in such a way that it is clear that they see these books as special and of equal authority as the Old Testament. Third, there are codices. Christians were among the first to write and copy books, not in the form of scrolls, but in the form of loose sheets of paper that were bound together on one side, giving us the familiar book-shaped books that we currently have. Some of these codices contain not just one or two of the New Testament books, but all of them, and sometimes with the Old Testament as well, giving us a very strong hint that these books were seen as canonical. Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a church father from the 2nd century. He was born in the 120s in Asia Minor, which is a modern-day Turkey, and he was in contact with Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who claims to have been in contact with John the Apostle. Later in life, Irenaeus moved to Gaul, or France as it is now known, and became the bishop of Lyon in the late 170s. He spent a lot of his time arguing against Gnosticism, an early Christian heresy, and he was the first author to explicitly state that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were essential for the Christian faith. So kind of like a mini-canon. In the rest of his extensive writings, he quotes from 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament in such a way that it was clear that they were implicitly canonical. The so-called missing books were the books of Philemon, Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 3 John, and Jude. All except for Hebrews are quite short, by the way. Muratorian Canon. An anonymous text named the Muratorian Canon is often dated to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. It is interesting as it explicitly talks about books that are accepted in the Catholic Church, that is, the Universal Church, clearly talking about the canon of the New Testament. It includes the four Gospels, though the beginning of the manuscript is missing. Luke is introduced as the 3rd Gospel and John the 4th, Acts, all of Paul's letters, 1st and 2nd John, Jude, and Revelation. There is a revelation or apocalypse of Peter, but it is noted that it is not universally accepted, and the Shepherd of Hermas is recommended, but also not universally accepted, since it was written recently. Tertullian. The Carthaginian church father Tertullian, who lived from the 150s until at least 220, was quite influential. He certainly believed that there was a canon of the New Testament, but he didn't give an explicit list. From his writings, which are mostly in Latin and a little bit in Greek, it is clear, however, that he included at least the four Gospels, Acts, all of Paul, 1 Peter, 1 John, Jude, and Revelation. Clement. Clement of Alexandria was a contemporary of Tertullian, as he lived from roughly 150 to 215. He was from Athens, but he studied in Alexandria, hence his name. Similar to Tertullian, he too quotes almost all of the New Testament books except for Philemon, James, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. Hippolytus. I do want to give a shout out to Hippolytus of Rome. Not because he's the most important voice in this debate, but because he wrote a 10-volume work called Refutation of All Heresies, which is an invaluable resource for reconstructing the theories of pre-Socratic philosophers. In any case, he quotes as scripture most of the New Testament. Certainly the four Gospels, Acts, and most of Paul. He seems hesitant about Hebrews, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, and the letter of Barnabas. Origen. Origen was a younger contemporary, who lived from 185 to 253. He is a bit of a controversial figure in early Christianity, but there is no doubt that he was well read and well traveled. Originally, he is from Alexandria, and he finally settled in Caesarea after having visited Antioch, Athens, Arabia, Ephesus, and Rome. He reported that the 4 Gospels, Acts, 14 letters from Paul, so including Hebrews, 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation were universally accepted. The books of James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Jude were still disputed, even if Origen himself accepted them. Eusebius. Skipping ahead in time a little bit, we come to Eusebius of Caesarea. He lived from the early 260s to 339. He wrote a lot about history, including the history of the Church and the life of Emperor Constantine. He also, very helpfully, wrote a list of canonical books, and somewhat like me, he divided these books into 4 categories: universally accepted books, disputed books, spurious books, or books that are good but not canonical, and books that should be rejected. In the first category are the 4 Gospels, Acts, all of Paul's letters, Hebrews, 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation, though this last one is more near universal in its acceptance. In the second category of disputed books, he puts James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Jude. In the third category, we find the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Letter of Barnabas, the Didache, and the Gospel according to the Hebrews. In the fourth category of books that should be rejected, he put the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Matthias, the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of John, and others, as he believed them to be forgeries, heretical, and absurd. Complete Bibles. Since we have now arrived in the 4th century, let's now look at some complete New Testaments that are from this time. From the 4th century we have the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, and from the 5th century the Codex Alexandrinus. Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus have all 27 New Testament books, but Sinaiticus also has the letter of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, while Alexandrinus also includes 1st and 2nd Clement, and possibly also the Psalms of Solomon, though the end is damaged. Vaticanus likely had all 27 books and perhaps even more, but sadly the end is also damaged, so we are not completely sure about 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation. Note, by the way, that the order of books is a little bit different in these codices as in our New Testaments today. Athanasius. And finally, there is Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, a major figure in the early church, who lived from the late 290s to 373. He was famous for a lot of things, but in the context of this discussion, it is his 39th Easter letter that is most important. This is the first time in history any church leader lists precisely the 27 books we have in the New Testament today. He does add that the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas are truthful, and he approves of them being read. Now, the debate did continue for some time after that, but I think for now we've seen enough. Also, we have filled out 3 of the 4 quadrants, but the 4th quadrant has a few books in it, but what sort of books are those? And though these may be the primary sources about the formation of the canon, what do critical scholars today have to say about this process? And how do confessional scholars deal with this debate? And also, what is my opinion about all of this? For answers to those questions, see my next video, The New Testament Canon Evaluated. Thanks for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon or become a member on YouTube, follow the links in the description so you can see my videos early, vote on topics, ask questions, and more.